The drainage trench runs parallel to a service road, about 4 feet deep, cut to redirect stormwater during the rainy season. It's mostly dry this time of year, but the sides are steep and crumbly. When we arrived, I could hear the cub before I saw him, a high, strained cry that didn't sound like normal calling. It sounded tired. As we approached the trench edge, I spotted him wedged awkwardly between a clump of hardened mud and a jut of exposed pipe. His back legs were twisted beneath him, and every time he tried to push up, he slid lower. The soil around him was collapsing in small chunks. What made it complicated was the mother. She was about 30 yards away, pacing along the tree line, eyes fixed on us. She wasn't charging, but she wasn't relaxed either. A lioness with a cub in distress is not something you take lightly. I've worked around lions for years, but you never get casual about it. We radioed to confirm her identity. Yes, it was the white lioness from Sector 3. No sedation team available immediately. That meant whatever we did had to account for her presence. I felt the weight of that immediately. The cub needed help, but she needed space and trust. We assessed the trench quickly. It wasn't deep enough to require climbing gear, but unstable enough to be dangerous if it caved in. The cub's breathing was fast, and he'd started to weaken. I lay flat on my stomach near the edge to look closer. His coat was almost cream, colored dusty now, with faint markings barely visible. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 weeks old. His eyes locked on mine, wide and confused. I could see scratches along his flank, probably from trying to climb. I felt that familiar tug between urgency and caution. Move too slowly, and he exhausts himself. Move too fast, and we trigger the mother. The lioness gave a low call, deep and resonant, not a roar, but a statement. I froze instinctively. One of the rangers stepped slightly to the side, making himself visible but not threatening. We'd been trained to avoid direct confrontation. No sudden gestures, no raised voices. I spoke softly, more to steady myself than for her benefit. "We're helping him," I murmured, though I knew she didn't understand the words. She crouched briefly, then stood again, watching. The distance between us felt fragile, like something that could snap with one wrong move. We decided I would descend carefully into the trench, while the others maintained a visual on the lioness. I slid down slowly, boots dislodging bits of dirt. The cub tried to scramble when I approached, but he was too tired to get far. Up close, he looked smaller than he had from above. I could see where his paw was wedged between the pipe and packed mud. I reached out slowly, letting him sniff my glove. He hissed weakly, but didn't strike. His strength was fading, which worried me more than aggression would have. Freeing his paw took longer than I expected. The mud had hardened almost like clay around the pipe. I used my fingers to chip it away carefully, trying not to pull his leg at the wrong angle. Each time I moved him slightly, he cried out, and each cry was answered by the lioness with a tense, pacing step. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I kept my movements deliberate and steady. Finally, the paw came loose, but he was still stuck at the hips. His hindquarters angled awkwardly against the trench wall. At that point, something shifted. The lioness moved close enough that I could see her whiskers clearly. She stopped about 15 yards away and sat down. It wasn't a threat posture. It was watchful, alert. It felt like she was measuring us, deciding whether we were a danger or an aid. I stayed low, avoiding eye contact, focusing on the cub. One of my colleagues spoke quietly into the radio, updating bass but keeping the volume minimal. We all understood that escalation would make everything worse. With the paw free, I adjusted my grip under the cub's chest and tried to lift him gently upward. He struggled instinctively, claws catching my sleeve. For a moment, I worried he'd twist and injure himself further. I paused, letting him settle, then shifted strategy. Instead of lifting him straight up, I rotated him sideways, easing his hips out from the packed dirt. The soil crumbled a bit more, but not enough to collapse. After another slow pull, his body slid free into my arms. He was lighter than I expected, ribs faintly visible under his coat. The moment I had him fully free, the lioness stood again. The air felt charged. I didn't climb out immediately. Sudden upward movement might trigger pursuit. Instead, I held the cub close to my chest and waited, crouched in the trench. The cub squirmed weakly, then let out a softer sound, less panic, more confusion. The lioness stepped forward a few paces, stopping just short of the trench edge. She wasn't snarling, she wasn't roaring. She was watching intently, ears forward, body steady. I slowly extended the cub upward toward the edge, while one of my colleagues stepped back to create a clear line of sight between mother and cub. The idea wasn't to hand him to her directly. That would be reckless. But to give her visual confirmation that he was alive and unharmed. The cub let out a faint call. The lioness responded immediately with a deep, reassuring rumble. That sound changed everything. It wasn't defensive. It was maternal. I felt my shoulders drop slightly for the first time since arriving. With careful coordination, I climbed out of the trench while keeping my body angled away from her. Once at the top, I lowered the cub gently onto the ground about 10 feet in front of her and stepped back slowly, hands visible, movements controlled. The cub wobbled unsteadily for a moment, then found his footing. He looked around, disoriented, then recognized her scent. He stumbled toward her, letting out a small, uneven chirp. We stayed completely still until they were well within the brush. Only when we were certain she wouldn't circle back did we allow ourselves to speak normally again. I realized my shirt was soaked through with sweat. My hands were trembling, not dramatically, just enough to notice. One of the rangers gave a small nod and said, "Good call, not rushing it." I nodded back. It hadn't felt like bravery. It had felt like a restraint. The trench would need reinforcement later, for now the immediate crisis was over. The lioness closed the remaining distance in a few strides. She didn't rush us. She went straight to the cub, sniffed him thoroughly from head to tail, and licked the dirt from his face. The cub pressed into her chest as if nothing had happened. She glanced in our direction once brief, unreadable, and then gently took him by the scruff. That simple gesture felt like a release of tension that had been building for nearly an hour. She carried him toward the tree line, moving steadily but without haste. That evening, when I wrote the incident report, I kept it factual. White lion cub extracted from drainage trench, reunited with mother, no sedation required. Reading it back, it looked simple. It wasn't. It was patience, measured steps, trust in experience, and respect for an animal's instinct. What stayed with me most wasn't the tension. It was the moment she answered his cry with that low, steady rumble. She didn't need saving. She needed space to do what she was already trying to do. And in the end, she was the one who truly saved him. I was on day shift at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Reserve when the radio call came through about a cub stuck near the drainage trench along the eastern perimeter. It was mid, morning already hot, the kind of dry heat that makes dust hang in the air. At first I assumed it was one of the usual situations, an antelope caught in fencing or a warthog tangled in brush. Then the ranger clarified. It was a white lion cub. My stomach tightened a little at that. We only had one white lioness in that sector, and she'd given birth earlier in the season. Cubs wander. They don't always understand boundaries. I grabbed gloves, a rope, and a first aid kit without really thinking about what we might find.